Hello, and welcome to our discussion on absolute and relative risk reduction. An absolute risk reduction is the change in the risk of an outcome of a given treatment in relation to a comparison treatment. It is better for a clinical relevant number, and it is better to look at and use compared to a relative risk reduction. In order to find the absolute risk reduction, you'll take the event rate without treatment minus the event rate. The relative risk reduction is the ratio of the probability of an event occurring in a treatment group to the probability of the event occurring in a comparison non-treatment group. Because it is a standardized number, it can be compared across studies, and it is most often used in news reports. In order to find the relative risk reduction, you will take the absolute risk reduction value and divide that by the event rate without treatment.
Now we are going to show you how to find the absolute and the relative risk reduction ratios. For our example, we are going to use data from a study assessing the effect of a falls prevention clinic on the rate of falls and related injuries of home-dwelling older adults. In order to figure out the absolute and relative risk reduction ratios, we first need to figure out the experimental event rate, which represents the rate of falls with treatment, and the control event rate, which represents the rate of falls without treatment. In order to get the experimental event rate, you will take the number of falls in the intervention group, which is 296, and divide that number by the total amount of participants in the intervention group, which is 661. When you do this, the experimental event rate will come out to about 45%. Next, we will need to figure out the control event rate. You will take the number of falls in the control group, which is 349, and divide that number by the total amount of participants in the control group, which is 653. When you do this, the control event rate will come out to about 53%. Now that we have these values, we can go on to figure out the absolute and relative risk reduction ratios. As mentioned earlier, to figure out the absolute risk reduction ratio, you will need to take the experimental event rate, which is 45%, and subtract that from the control event rate, which is 53%. When you do this, the absolute risk reduction ratio comes out to 8%. Now that we have this value, we can figure out the relative risk reduction ratio. Again, as mentioned earlier, to figure this out, we will take the absolute risk reduction ratio that we just figured out, which is 8%, and divide that by the control event rate, which is 53%. When you do this, the relative risk reduction ratio comes out to about 15%.